Tonight on a story we first reported in April about Iranian citizens who were deported from the Mesa Gateway Airport back to Iran. A new lawsuit accuses the U.S. government of illegally revealing confidential information about these asylum seekers to the Iranian regime, putting their lives at risk once they arrive back in Iran. Morgan Lowe originally reported this story for us in April and is here with the update. What kind of information are we talking about?
So the Trump administration is accused of giving the Iranian government information from these people's asylum claims. So this could be information that maybe one of them had converted to Christianity, which would put them in danger back home, or that the asylum seekers are gay or lesbian, which is a crime in Iran. According to this lawsuit, revealing that information would be illegal. Since last fall, the U.S. government has deported more than 100 Iranian citizens back to Iran, including more than 50 who were flown out of the ICE facility at Mesa Gateway Airport. According to the lawsuit filed yesterday on behalf of the Iranian American Legal Defense Fund, the Trump administration cut a deal with the Iranians in March of 2025, agreeing to provide a list of Iranian citizens the U.S. wanted to deport, along with their immigration records and asylum applications. The latest deportation flight left Mesa Gateway during Iran's crackdown on pro-democracy protesters this spring. The plaintiffs say revealing asylum information put their lives at risk.
It's extremely dangerous because people are revealing in their asylum application the reasons that they fear persecution by the government of Iran if they're returned. So it might be that they participated in pro-democracy demonstrations, which would put them at risk once they're back in Iran.
Michael Kirkpatrick is the attorney handling this case. He's asking a federal judge to order the U.S. government to stop sharing this information with the Iranians and to let the people whose information has already been shared know that they are in danger. We received this statement from Congresswoman Yasmin Ansari, who is of Iranian descent, and she's been vocal about these deportations. She wrote, "If true, this would be a shocking betrayal of our legal and moral obligations." It does not appear that any Iranians have been sent back to Iran since the start of the war, but these deportations did take place after the U.S. bombed Iran last year and during that country's brutal crackdown on protesters, while the U.S. was criticizing the Iranian government for its treatment of its citizens. Now, the Department of Homeland Security is denying all of these allegations.
What do we know about the people who were deported? Did anything bad happen to them? Is there any way to tell?
We have not been able to get any information about it. We also talked to that lawyer today, and he said that it is like these people go back to Iran and they just disappear into a void. It is very difficult now, especially, to know what happened to them.
And unless they, contact him or contact the United States again somehow, or contact family members who are still here, it's like we'll never know, right?
Right. They have some anecdotal information that the people were questioned immediately when they arrived there, but after that, it's anybody's guess.
Vanished. Morgan Lowe, thank you.